Hey everyone! So, in the past, I've made a video about Black women in Big Brother US, so I figured it's time to talk about Black men in Big Brother US. And since I've made a video talking about Italian men in Big Brother USA, I'm going to continue talking about ethnic or racial groups in Big Brother USA and to see what we can find or discuss that is worth talking about and analyzing. So, we're going to start with William from Big Brother 1, and it's rare that I talk about Big Brother 1 in general. So, there's a lot of awkwardness with this one. He was very pro black and wanted to talk about it since he was a part of the Black Panthers, but no one was interested in hearing his perspective on everything. He was seen as aggressive, angry, and irrational, not only just with his behavior, which was filled with microaggressions, based off of how some of the other house guests saw him, but him wanting to strategize was also villainized as well. Because this was Big Brother 1, this was a popularity contest and they wanted to come off as likable to America, and they thought that strategizing was villainous and was something that America would hate. With this in mind, he would be the first boot of the season. Virtually all of the arguments of the season involved him. Cassandra had to tell him that he needed to be a quote unquote polite black man in so many words so he could adapt. There are many situations and times in the black community where we are told to tone ourselves down and to hold back just so we can make people feel comfortable, even if we aren't doing any uncomfortable actions ourselves. So now it's time to talk about Marcellas. So there was the very awkward situation in the first week where he was potentially isolated by the all white alliance, which just happened to have been Caucasian, for being gay and black. In addition to that, there was Jerry who wanted to be the quote unquote white savior, which just made things so much worse with the veto situation. Marcellus could tell that he was being isolated, and some of the ways that Josh would describe Marcellus was very weird. And with the situation, Jerry himself admitted that he had prejudices. So clearly, maybe this entire situation was just projection on his part, but there could have been a very real possibility that he was isolated because of his race. And of course, his sexuality as well, but this video is specifically talking about race. And the worst part of it is that this was dangled like a toy for game purposes, which kind of sucks because this is what happened 20 years later in the current season. So we're dealing with similar situations. So Roddy was mad in the final six when Marcellus nominated him for eviction, and Roddy goes to the backyard to mansplain very condescendingly to Marcellus and Danielle, where Marcellus essentially calls him out in the diary room for mansplaining to the two black people in the house, like he, meaning Roddy, was superior to them, and like they, Danielle and Marcellus, didn't know any better. So he felt the microaggressions coming from Roddy. So in All Stars, he was isolated again, and all the men disliked him for some weird reason. But I don't know if this had anything to do with race, sexuality, etc. There was the situation during Kiara and Josh's fight in week 5, where Josh told Marcellus that he would have went home in the first week had Jerry not defeated him, and it caused Marcellus to have to relive that trauma and cried about it, which led to the fight between Kiara and Josh. And now we're going to move on to Marvin. So he was a very unique casting choice since they generally do not cast black men like him in general, who was just very opinionated but very quirky as well and had a very dark sense of humor that wouldn't be palatable for the CBS audience. So I always found it weird that Marvin wasn't included in the Four Horsemen alliance, despite him wanting to work with them and sending Glory home on his HOH. Outside of that, they actively planned to target him when he could have been a very useful number for them, especially with what happened to the all-white Four Horsemen alliance in the succeeding weeks. So that kind of alienation was just very odd, and it just shows that People work with who they feel comfortable with. So a lot of his behavior in the house made the other house guests uncomfortable, but I don't know if it had anything to do with his race per se. His comments were overboard and were a lot to do with at times, which has not aged well, especially with some of his flirty antics. So there was the situation with Adria claiming that she used the Bible to make her nominations in week 6, which had horrible optics because a black man and a gay man was put on the nomination block, and they are two minorities, though for very different reasons. Marvin didn't handle it well and called her out on using that card and the other microaggressions that she played a part in transpiring all week. They had several arguments about it during the entire week. And then in the finale, he accused Cowboy of either being a racist liar or a lying racist. Clearly, this was some feed stuff that wasn't on the episode and got lost in the archives, since a lot of the stuff that happened on the feeds from those days aren't easy to find on the internet. But the fact that he said this clearly felt that he felt some microaggressions or some other potentially racist antics from Cowboy. But this also could have led to my first point that I mentioned about him being excluded from the Four Horsemen Alliance. So that could tie together in that way. So the next person that I'm going to discuss in chronological order is Beau. And honestly, there isn't really anything notable in my opinion, but I don't know if it was due to him being under-edited on the actual show, and like I mentioned with Marvin, a lot of the feed archives were lost. But the fact that he was under-edited is interesting because he was a more subdued, quiet guy, and they like to cast their Black House guests to be very obnoxious, but it was a double flipped coin with him because they also like casting their gay men to be very obnoxious. And because he didn't fit into that stereotype for either categories, he was under-edited. So, chronologically, the next person is Parker. So, casting interviewed all the house guests before they cast them, clearly, and they knew that Ryan had an issue with interracial relationships, which is problematic enough on its own. With Ryan's real-life girlfriend, Jen, being on the show, the producers decided to put her in a pair with Parker, the only black man on the show, to cause some drama with Ryan since he hated that she dated a black person in her past. So they set up the situation that would cause drama using racial lines involved, and it put Parker in a very vulnerable and dangerous situation where he could have potentially gotten heat from someone else's racism, essentially. So outside of that and how casting set him up, essentially, he was immediately seen as shady to the house guests, and Jacob led a charge against Parker, which was only an issue because Parker was in power, so they all sold him out. He was always seen as someone who was dramatic when he didn't even cause any of the drama that happened in the house and was nowhere near the most dramatic person in the house. But because of his race, it was always amplified with him, and he was always seen as dramatic, hence him being booted first, in addition to all the Jen stuff. Okay, so the next person is Ollie, and here was around the time when they started pushing the religious black person edit, and producers heavily pushed his religion on the edit, and somewhat made it seem like a joke from how it was portrayed and edited on the show. On the feeds, he apparently made some comments about not being quote-unquote that type of black person, and compared his skin tone to Libra's like he was better than her, and he would always put himself in a position where he was an accepting black person compared to Libra. And of course, he called Libra a scallywag, which made it on the edit and was just horrible. So now it's time to discuss Kevin. He was called a racist term by Braden, who assumed he was Latin, hence making a slur in relation to Mexican people, which is problematic in itself because you're assuming someone is something else without knowing the facts, and using a racist term based off of your horrible preconceived notions. But this situation caused him to drift towards the POC majority side of the house, since he felt like people like Jeff didn't stand up for him enough and didn't condemn Braden enough. A lot of people overlooked the situation due to game reasons and was perfectly fine with keeping Brayden in the house, despite his racist antics. He would continuously feel uncomfortable around Jeff throughout the rest of the season, and he would talk about this in All Stars, though I don't know if he felt uncomfortable with Jeff due to the racial differences or the differences between their sexuality. So in All Stars, he was told by Devon that him being biracial meant that he wasn't black enough and he felt excluded due to being biracial. He was always on the out in both of his seasons, but I don't know if that was because of an amalgamation between his race and sexuality or just other reasons. So with Keith, he wasn't around long at all, clearly since he was a week 1 boot, but he was still portrayed as loud and obnoxious. Also, his religion was also a huge focus and was portrayed as some sort of joke, like it was with Ollie and a few other black women house guests. There really isn't much to discuss about Lawon. I think most of his portrayal involved him filling archetypes that gay men tend to have on Big Brother over archetypes that black men tend to have on the show. Of course, he's just generally remembered for being a fool to send himself home, but that's it. So Howard is next, and oh my gosh. The first thing that I do remember is that they pushed his religion heavily on the show from my recollection, which is just a continuous trend at this point in Big Brother history with their black house guests. There were a lot of racist comments that were made in his presence in the house, and then there was the Pillgate incident that he witnessed. We saw the comments he and Candace made about it, and during it, you see that he's telling her to give up the bed, and I saw this as him wanting her to be the quote-unquote agreeable black person just to keep the peace, and she's tired of it. So as the weeks went on, the racist comments continued, and he was essentially forced in a duo with Candace. As they were seen as outcasts and isolated, essentially, people made fun of the way he spoke a lot, and they were essentially outcasted. People making fun of the way he spoke is generally something that always happens with black people, and it was a way of them insinuating that he was uneducated and ignorant, and the editors would also make fun of the way he spoke. And then there was the element where people saw him as some sort of predator due to some alleged comments he may or may not have made to Amanda, who was obsessed with targeting him at this point. So with Devin, he made a lot of bad game moves during his HOH, and people were rightfully upset about it. So after Paola and Zach essentially yelled at him, where he didn't say much, though a part of the reason why I think he didn't say much is because he didn't want to be seen as the scary, aggressive black man, and they brought up some personal stuff, he hid in his HOH room for the rest of his duration in the house, and everyone was quote-unquote scared of Devin, despite him never losing his anger, especially compared to some of the other house guests in the house. People like Nicole mentioned that they feared for their safety with Devin in the house and pushed that scary narrative on him, and he essentially isolated himself for his final week and a half in the game, to the point where production had to force him to campaign when he was on the block, since there was no footage. So he didn't even feel comfortable. With Jozea, he essentially started a POC alliance with half of the house, and because Victor was safe, the veterans and the alliance targeted him. I don't think this had anything to do with his race per se, but the fact that he wanted to make a POC alliance definitely brought it into perspective, and he had POCs Zakia and Devon sell him out. And I think this led to why Jozea, who was eventually partnered with Devon in the challenge Final Reckoning, felt some sort of way because he felt like she kind of sold him out and used the race card, essentially. So, with Ramses, the only memorable thing about him, in my opinion, was him claiming that he wasn't black in his preseason interviews because he is Dominican. Anyways, he was isolated from the game the entire time, was deemed untrustworthy for very little reason, though there have been white nerds who have gotten leeway despite acting the same way he has, and no one saw him as valuable in the house, where he was a disposable boot in the late pre-jury when Jessica won HOH. So Swaggy is next. For some reason, production allowed him to wear Swaggy C shirts in the house, which made him come off as obnoxious to many of the house guests, and he was portrayed as being a loudmouth on the show, though he was very calm and introverted in the house from what was shown on the live feeds. So his portrayal in real life and his portrayal on the show were two completely different things. And the fact that they actually allowed him to call himself Swaggy C is just very weird. Almost like they wanted him to be this obnoxious, boisterous black man that he just generally wasn't. So, for some reason, Tyler was threatened by Swaggy, despite them butting over their deceased fathers and Swaggy telling him everything about his game to earn some sort of loyalty and trust there. And then there's a situation where Winston tried to act like Swaggy was scary and intimidating during their one tiff, even though Winston was the one to start it to begin with. Kyland would also say a bunch of stuff about how he was scary and intimidating to justify targeting him, though he had done nothing but treat her with kindness and respect in the house up to that point. So she clearly used microaggressions to justify her stabbing him in the back. So next on the chronological list is David. So he was one of the four that was immediately outcasted to play in the safety comp with the older man, the black woman, and a plus-size Hispanic woman because he was seen as untrustworthy by Jackson for literally no reason. As soon as David came back into the house, due to the camp comeback twist, the Majority Alliance compared him to a jailbird, a sexual predator, claimed that this isn't BET in reference to him, claiming that he essentially didn't belong in CBS or other areas where they acclimated, essentially, and a bunch of other disgusting racist microaggressions. And this was before David could even get a chance to properly introduce himself to the house guests. Remember, up until this point, he was only in the house for a few hours, where he was essentially forced to fight to compete to stay in the house. And when he came back in the house for this twist, it hadn't even been an hour before people like Jack, Jackson, Holly, so on and so forth, just rambled with their racist microaggressions. So in All-Stars, the all-white alliance of the committee formed, which he of course was not included in, partially because Memphis was obsessed with disliking David, which some in the house felt like was aggressive, especially with how he would treat David and how he would kind of physically tap him at certain points of time. Devin, of course, falsely accused David of being an Uncle Tom because she was lied to about the Ian vote, and he tried his very best to not flip out over it, since it was an agonizing situation for him, and he didn't want to come off a certain way. I am also going to mention that the fact that they even put him on All Stars to begin with was a clear sign that they used him as a token black male, especially because black men did really, really poorly for the last decade before All Stars even happened, and he was from the most recent season. So they essentially used him as a token black man casting spot. So I was thinking about grouping the 3 cookout men like I did with the 3 cookout women, but I couldn't because even in the most pro-black season of Big Brother ever, there were some harsher treatment towards some of the black men that deserves to be talked about and deserves to be analyzed separately. So with this in mind, I'm going to start with Kyland. In the very first week, Frenchie, for some reason, did not trust Kyland whatsoever, despite Kyland not even doing anything, and Frenchie started spazzing out on him as Frenchie threw some microaggressions and stuff to the point that Kyland ended up crying in Derek X's arms at the end of it. Outside of that, there really wasn't much to talk about due to the cookout, but it became clear to me that he seemed insecure because he was half black and felt the need to prove how quote-unquote black he was at various points in the season. He would also talk about who quote-unquote best represented the cookout, which could be an entire essay, an entire video on its own. So I'm going to just move on. There really isn't anything for me to talk about with Derek F, so I'm just going to move on. So, with Xavier, I remember during the same meeting with Frenchie where he met up with the male Scamper Squad members, which included Kyland at some point before Kyland left. Xavier was trying to defend Kyle and calm the situation down, and Frenchie immediately accused Xavier of being threatening and intimidating, despite Xavier not doing anything of the sort. So even Xavier wasn't exempt from dealing with microaggressions. So outside of that, he would make a lot of comment about being quote unquote an Oreo, was obsessed with showing off his white former step family to show how quote unquote white he is. I was very obsessed with being appealing to white people. It seemed like he wanted to be the quote unquote token black person, and with the way the hierarchy of the cookout was set up, everyone thought he would be the most deserving winner, since he's the most safe and palatable role model in the group, which has so many other implications that I could go on about, but I'm not going to, because I do not want to rant and it's just frustrating for me to talk about. So now we're going to move on to the current season and talk about Terrance. Of course, he was grouped in with the so-called non-existent POC group that Kyle came up with in his head and told the others about, but it seemed like the White House guests were fine with Terrance since he was the least threatening and planned to take him further along to the end. Terrance would make a lot of assumptions that Taylor and Monte were not black because they had different experiences than him, especially economically, and didn't have the same sort of struggle relating to their economic journeys or due to their experience with white people. What was interesting with Terrance is that he was fine with keeping Kyle in the house and wanted Kyle to quote unquote use this as a learning experience, so he wanted to keep Kyle in the house, but he never showed disgrace to any of the other black or POC house guests. And last but not least is Monte. So during the first week, Daniel went to Monte to validate targeting Taylor because Daniel didn't want to catch flack for nominating a black woman and putting a black woman beside a black man, thinking that if a black man approved this, then Daniel would be off the clear. And because Monte was a black man, which Monte would go on and on about during the first week, like he's the standard of blackness and for blackness and the morality of black people, like he's the figurehead for black people, he would talk about how Taylor is a bad representation for black women, so on and so forth. It's even disgusting now that they're in a showman and in a relationship. I'm sure that's going to work out well in real life. But that's a whole nother topic. So, soon after the leftovers were formed, Kyle became paranoid. During Monte's HOH, Kyle started calling Monte and Joseph arrogant, despite neither of them displaying any actions of that trait. A few days later, Kyle starts telling his white allies in the leftovers that the POC in his alliance will join the other POCs in the house to make a cookout alliance, completely missing the point that the cookout was about black people, not people of color, and called Monte, as well as the other POC allies, as loud, strong personalities, would state that he felt jumped by them, accused them of being aggressive, and a bunch of other microaggressions. Michael and Brittany also tried to push the narrative that Monte made women uncomfortable because they wanted to target him and didn't have any game reason to target him. So they tried doing that as well. And of course, he and Terrance didn't handle it well when Kyle's revelation was revealed to the house by Michael and Brittany, and they were both very angry with the two of them for using race for convenient gameplay. Since I discussed Danielle from Big Brother Over the Top in the Black Woman video, it's only fair for me to talk about Justin in Big Brother Over the Top in this video. Of course, a lot of the White House guests made him seem like he was very aggressive, ghetto, and uneducated, and there was a lot of gaslighting pertaining him. There was that awkward situation with Monte. I almost forgot there's more than one Monte, where Justin essentially kind of had to put him in his place, especially since they're all also kind of going against Danielle as well. And the situation was just very awkward. So that is my rundown on the black men that have been on Big Brother USA and some of the tough things they had to go through on their specific seasons and situations. So it just shows that we have a lot of progress to do. And even with the POC 50-50 casting implementation put in place, we still have a long way to go to avoid the negative mindsets that affect Black people. So I'm already planning a video on Asian house guests, and I have to divide that video into 3 parts because there haven't been many East Asians, Southeast Asians, South Asians, or Western Asians. I guess that's 4 categories. So I'm going to have to split that up into 4 categories and to talk about all the issues that these different groups had to deal with as well. So thank you all for watching. I'm enjoying talking about the content relating to these racial groups and how people in these racial groups have had their hand dealt in the Big Brother USA house. Thank you, and I'll be back with something soon.